If we can just start our last session on, it's on intergenerational transmission, beliefs, and cognition. We just have two very short talks. The first talk is going to be by Landry Quate. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. So if you could please join us, Landry. Excited to hear your presentation.
Yes. Are you all able to see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the organizer. Today, I'm presenting the paper entitled The Fetal Origin of Cognitive Aging. This is a joint work with Roland Pongo and Nicholas Rivers. In this paper, we answer the question of whether and how prenatal temperature shocks affect cognition during aging. Why do we care about cognition during aging? Well, people are living longer everywhere in the world. And for this reason, we need to better understand factors that contribute to successful aging. Cognition is one of such factors. Better cognitive performance reduce dependency in old age and allow the elderly to remain economically productive. In addition, the biology literature has established that the brain of a fetus or a child is sensitive to temperature shocks. However, studies on the persistent effect of prenatal temperature shocks on cognition during aging remain scarce. So in this paper, we answer the question of whether and how exposure to prenatal temperature shocks affect cognition during aging. We are also interested in knowing which stage of pregnancy is most crucial. This figure depicts our conceptual framework. Broadly speaking, biology is the main channel through which prenatal temperature affect cognition during aging. A negative temperature shocks has a direct effect on the fetal brain formation and an indirect effect through the health of the mother and the child. So this effect in turn affect the human capital accumulation and socio-economic status that are the key determinant for cognitive reserve. Therefore, a person's cognitive reserve affect the later life cognitive performance. So this is the channel we want to assess here. To investigate our research question, we use the ALSI data. It is a longitudinal population-based study conducted in Royal Ajanko, South Africa. We use here the first round of the survey that took place in 2015 and involved individuals over 40 years old. Information on place and date of birth was collected in order to get the place, the municipality of birth of individual in our sample. So this chart is a key to our analysis in the sense that we will exploit the spatial and temporal variation in exposure to temperature, to prenatal temperature. The novelty with ALSI is also the way cognition is measured using the standard approach in psychology literature. So participants complete a battery of assessments designed to evaluate the ability to learn and remember and make judgments. So this is our main outcome of interest. We complement this primary data with the well-known climate data from University of Delaware air temperature and precipitation data set. And we do a merge based on municipality of birth and month of birth in order to get our final data set. Oops. So our identification strategy rely on the causal effect of prenatal temperature. So we estimate this nonlinear equation in temperature where we have the cognition score of an individual E born in municipality J on a month of birth M and on the year T. So we decompose our effect in trimester before, during, and after the birth. We also control for year of birth fixed effect, contemporaneous weather indicator, mainly precipitation and temperature, and also some individual characteristics comprising sex, age, ethnicity, and religion. So our main result is report on this in this table. We find that temperature occurring at shocks occurring at the first trimester decrease overall the pregnancy, the score, the adult score later in life. For instance, a marginal increase in temperature during the first trims lead to the 28% decrease in the cognition score. We also interest in some heterogeneity in the impact. We try a bunch of check by looking at the sensitivity by gender, by age group, by some family attributes. But here, I plot the effect by gender. Overall, we find that the effect on the first trimester is more harmful for the female compared to male, but later in the pregnancy course, the male seems to be more likely to suffer from the shock, temperature shock. Finally, we try a bunch of mechanisms to help understand how our effect operate. We look at the effect by translate by education, literacy, childhood health. But here I report the one on sleep quality, and the effect seems to be consistent with the one occur on the cognition. So to conclude, this paper answered the question of how does exposure to prenatal temperature shocks affect cognition during aging. Our main finding, we can derive two insights from this paper so far. So first, the first trim is the more crucial period, window period of pregnancy, and the negative effect that we get seems to be larger for women and older individuals. And we also document a reduced sleep as a possible mechanism behind our finding, our effect. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. So if there are any questions, if you could please raise your hand or put them in the chat box. Supreet, please go ahead.
Thank you for that. That was really interesting. I was wondering if you also see that this affects things like earnings or labor supply or other outcomes in the data set that you're looking at?
Yeah, this is something we would like to investigate too. These variable, but unfortunately, with our sample, we do not have these such information. We have instead the occupational sector, the occupation of a person. So we intend to check whether being conditional on being in the certain activity will make you more exposed or more likely to suffer from such cognition impairment.
Got it. That's interesting. I mean, I do think that in the same context, there are probably other data sets where you could look at that, because I mean, since the variation you're using is rainfall, and you know where any data set that tells you where somebody's born and has what they're doing right now would allow you to look at that, and that could be a nice complement to the analysis that you've done.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, we can try another, like we can make an external validity of our funding by using another context, another data to address this interesting question.
Any other questions? Well, I guess one question I had, Landry. So I think is it the case that you found that the effects were strongest when in the first trimester?
Yeah,
Is that the case? Okay. And does that sort of line up with sort of what we know about kind of prenatal development or fetal development, aspects of brain developments or anything like that? I'm just sort of curious if you have a reason to expect kind of those effects to occur during the first trimester.
Yes, indeed. Like when we like this result parallel with the fetal programming argument that basically states that the first stream is the one where when the brain formation occur, like the initial stage of brain formation occur. So I guess the baby or the fetus is more sensitive to this to any shocks happen in these windows. So this is something that make our result, like we believe that this something strengthen our result. So yeah, this is the intuition behind this funding.
Got it. Got it. Interesting. All right. Well, thank you very much. So I think we're going to move on to our next speaker, and then we can have a discussion with both panelists later. So our next speaker is Maximilian Mueller, and they'll talk about bias memory and intergenerational transmission of fertility preferences.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thanks for sticking around till the end. So what I want to talk about is kind of where beliefs come from. We talked about yesterday about educational aspiration. You know, if they're low, where do they come from? Has that to do with your own life path maybe? And do you pass that on to the next generation? So for that, we need long-term data. We need kind of variable life outcomes for individual, and the context in which I study this is in Western Kenya, looking at reproductive desires. So how many kids women want to have, and then how many kids they actually do have 11 years later, and looking at you know, whether they're able to remember what they wanted when they were 20, 23, and then whether their memory is associated with what they pass on to the next generation. So to motivate this a little bit, sometimes we see young people having different views than old generations, but over time, you know, as they become richer, they become more conservative. They believe it wasn't luck, but you know, their wealth was well deserved. We see very strong a strong transmission in educational aspiration. And the question here is, you know, why does that happen, and why do parents and older generations often advise younger generations to follow similar paths to their own? And that's related to cultural persistence and asking, you know, why is culture often so persistent, especially in some contexts, such as genital cutting, you know, where kind of the women who underwent the procedure are especially likely to support that practice, and we wonder why that is. So the setting here, we are in Western Kenya, and I use data from one survey round that's still in the field, and combine it with information we have from roughly 11 years ago. Here I focus on, so apparently my neighbor is doing some repairs today, and especially now, but oh well. So I focus on women, and that is roughly 1,600. And they were 22 in the first survey round I focused on, and are now 33. So here, looking at kind of how outcomes compared to their initial desires, I use data from these 2 survey rounds. Here, just looking at the evolution of desires, what we see is that at an age of 22, 23, most women wanted 2, 3, or 4 kids, and now in their 30s, most women want 3, 4, 5 kids. So on average, desires went up from 3.2 to 4 kids. This is associated with quite a bit of excess fertility, so women having more children than they desired in the past. That applies to 35% of women already at this age, and it's only likely to become more prevalent as they have another 11 years of childbearing left. So now I wonder, with these different outcomes, are women actually able to recall that they have more children than they wanted in the past, or fewer children than they wanted in the past? So for that, we asked them to recall what they would have said in the year they were first interviewed. And then I derived this recall error, which is simply what they recall minus what they said in the past. So looking here at those with an excess fertility of -1, which means that they wanted 3 kids, for example, and so far they have 2. Okay, and a value of 1 here would mean that you would overestimate your past desires by 1. So you had said you wanted 3 children, but now you remember you actually wanted 4. Okay, so here this seems actually relatively unbiased, right? It's centered at 0, and then there are some that overestimate how many they wanted and some that underestimate. So while it looks quite unbiased for them, here I'm plotting this for your excess fertility from -3 to 3. And you can see that once women have more children than they wanted, the modal answer changes from 0 to how many children they have more than they wanted in the past. You also see that if you're very far away from how many kids you wanted, recall also seems biased in terms of to the other side, that you underestimate how many children you wanted. Okay, so this does not look at like unbiased recall at all, but it looks very biased. So we might wonder, given that overestimating is much more likely than underestimating, why this is so. Are these memories suppressed? Are they forgotten? And are there some motivations behind this? So for that, we incentivize participants to get their recall, their past number correctly, and they will be paid 20 or 40 cents. And we want to see whether that improves recall or not. And while it does improve recall for those without excess fertility, for those with excess fertility, maybe their estimate goes down by 1, but they don't get all the way to 0. Okay, so even with monetary incentives, those with excess fertility don't more often say that the correct answer, how many children they wanted in the past. And that's not because they don't spend more time on the question. So once you pay them, they spend more time thinking. Okay, and on a more neutral question, those with excess fertility actually do improve recall. But here we just don't see it for their recall of past reproductive desires. Okay, so we might wonder, are these memories really undesirable and actually forgotten over time, seemingly 1 child at a time? So for that purpose, we also offer them an information offer so they can find out what they had said in the past. Okay, so at the end of the fertility section, we tell them that we asked them 11 years ago, and if they want to, they can find out at the end of the survey. Once we couple that with a monetary incentive of 20 cents, and once it's just the info. And for others, we just offer money. So if we do that, we don't see a difference when we only offer the information. But once we couple that with monetary incentive, the take-up is very high by those without excess fertility. but for those with excess fertility, it's actually lower, suggesting that there are some individuals for which this information is somewhat costly. Okay, so they're avoiding kind of finding out the answer. This gap also increases with the number of children. And importantly, if I compare monetary incentives only versus monetary incentives plus the information, I see that the information increases take-up for those with less than 3 kids, but it lowers take-up for those with 4 or more children, suggesting that it really is this information that is undesirable. And then another suggestive evidence is that once you offer a monetary incentive, the more time elapses between the offer and the decision to take it up, the bigger the gap is between those with and without excess fertility. So those with excess fertility seem to be able to forget the offer if they have enough time to forget them. So combining the recall and the information, it seems that to some extent, memories both seem to be forgotten, but then also not completely forgotten, right? Because if they were completely forgotten, the women couldn't avoid this information treatment because they shouldn't have any clue. So now the next question is, does that affect the individuals and in particular society in some ways? So you might think that for the individual, it's actually good to have biased memory because it might help you love your undesired children more. You feel in control of your life. But on the other hand, there might be these effects on what advice you give to the next generation and the norms you pass on. So here I'm plotting, we're asking what number of children you would recommend to the next generation. Okay, and here I'm comparing on what you wanted in the past and how many children you have today. And those in red are those individuals that overestimate how many they wanted in the past. So those are the ones with biased memory. And you can see they always recommend the next generation to have more kids. This is just to show you this graphically. If I do a regression of this, those with worse memory recommend an 18-year-old to have half a child more and to get married earlier. So it does seem to affect fertility values they pass on to the next generation. I can do counterfactuals, and if I equip those with excess fertility with improved memory, the overall kind of recommendations to the next generation go down. And in turn, that might actually affect the next generation and how many kids they end up having. So to conclude, what I find is, people really form these beliefs as a reaction to what course their life takes, which might be due to lack or external factors not in their control. So if you want to change views of the young, it might not be that might not be enough to permanently change beliefs or traditions, but you might have to change incentives, circumstances, etc., to get a permanent shift in beliefs. The technology I find here is motivated selective memory and information avoidance. This is associated with what they pass on to the next generation. And while this might be individual optimal for your mental health, for example, there are potential negative externalities, could be positive in some other applications as well on the advice they pass on to the next generation. So this might contribute to increased cultural persistence, and we might think of whether we want to somehow record, what people said in the past, so that we can give de-biased advice to young generations without kind of harming the old generation's welfare. All right.
Thank you. Super interesting. So are there any questions? You could either raise your hands or put them in the chat box.
Everyone's tired.
I think everyone is probably a little bit tired. I mean, I can ask a question. So I think what you were presenting at the very end, I thought was really compelling. This idea that we have this sort of general feeling of wanting to positively evaluate potentially negative things that have happened to us as individuals. That's sort of could be adaptive for us, but this could also end up leading to a transmission of that sort of norm going forward. And I think you mentioned that changing the circumstances might be necessary for changing the norms. I wonder if you could just maybe expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think let's say you hope that you change the aspirations of the young, and they really behave differently and will change the circumstances. Here it seems that, let's say, for some reasons you follow social norms and the older generations, right? And then over time you make sense of it, and then you adopt these views that have been around for quite some time. So you make sense of them, and now if you talk to the next generation, you don't necessarily tell them that, when I was young, I wanted only 2 kids, but I had 4. So maybe if you really only want 2 kids, you should get married later. But you kind of you pass on a biased view of what happened to you, and then if we actually want to change these views permanently, there has to be something that in this example that helps women and men have fewer children, for example. Yeah, so.
Got it. And looks like Francisco has a question, so please go ahead.
Sure. I just want to follow up actually your question, because it was very interesting, concerning that we know that when people are young, for instance, adolescents, secondary school, and so on, they are more malleable for this kind of trait, like aspirations, desires, hopes. So I'm wonder, maybe pessimistic view, saying that maybe we do a lot of effort to change their aspirations and hopes and views when they are young, but then if something will happen in the middle, maybe all of these efforts might not work. So do you think this can be the idea? So if we don't, for instance, improve inequality in a developing country, potentially all of those kids who increase their aspiration during secondary school due to an intervention might not have any effect, because at the end this inequality might take them again into this poverty cycle and destroy, and I don't know, going back to this norm. I don't know.
So I think that's super interesting, and I mean, I have to speculate it because I can't say it based on the data, but my guess is that there are potential complementarities between changing the aspirations, but then if you increase aspirations, then you also have to be able to achieve them. If that's not possible, I think you might become frustrated and then expose rationalizing what happened. And so I guess whatever you change in terms of aspirations or views also has to be actionable or achievable to some extent, if that makes sense and answers or addresses your question.
Okay, thank you. So maybe we can just transition now to a broader conversation. If Landry can, well, Landry, you'll be spotlighted, and so both you and Maximilian, if there are any questions for either of our panelists, that'd be great. And I know that there are already some questions here in the chat. So let's see. So there's one question I think for you, Maximilian, from Nicholas, who says, do you have references on more theoretical models on cultural persistence of IGTV? I actually don't know what that is. What's the relevance of parents' experience and own experience?
So yeah, I think there is empirical work and theoretical work. So there is Bizin and Verdier have 3 or 4 papers that are theoretical, and I think you can look into that, kind of assuming that parents want the best to their kid, but they're imperfectly empathetic. They have imperfect empathy, and that leads to some transmission, but then also evidence that immigrants to the US have the number of kids they have kind of depends on the culture of where they come from and how many kids their parents have. So yeah, I think there is a lot of work in the field, but yeah, often it's hard to track these empirically over kind of a long time. And I see one question on family planning. I think that's very important. And in the data, if you just ask them, kind of 70% say that in the last year, they have used some modern form of contraceptives. So they say they have excess. It's not perfect, but they also, I don't think the view is whatever God gives me, is what I end up with. So they do try to limit the number of kids they have, but this seems, imperfect in this context.
Okay. Are there any other questions for our panelists? Or anything else that folks would sort of want to bring up? I know we're sort of at the very ends of our long 2 days here and Zoom fatigue is real. Okay, well, I guess in that case, we can end.